Hi everyone. So this one's going to be a little bit different from what I usually do. Um, Initially, I was going to make a very general, broad video on the issue of national stereotypes. That is to say, how different nationalities are perceived around the world by ostensibly the rest of us. Um, but I think that's a pretty broad subject because, it can be endless. You could talk about that all day, really. There's so many angles to take with it. Um, it goes without saying that stereotypes, if they're applied literally, can be a bad thing because it can lead to unfair prejudice, i.e., it can lead to people being judged solely because of what their passport says, and sometimes that's unfair. I think it's very, very important to remember that even in countries where people are not encouraged to think independently, i.e., more totalitarian states, people are ultimately individuals. So, whilst I think people can definitely be molded by their environment, particularly with nationalism, and you can see the effects of that around the world, I still think that people are individuals. I've been privileged in my life to meet people from all backgrounds. I do say privileged. I think it's an enriching thing. Um, I'm relatively well traveled. Are there some nationalities that I've had more contact with than others? Yes. Are there some nationalities that I'm perhaps more disposed to like? Maybe. I try to temper that by remembering that you can't generalize. Just because I like some people in a particular country, dislike some people in another country, doesn't mean that I should be hostile to an entire nation. And I try to remember that. Now, I think this differs somewhat from politics. So, for example, I consider the Five Eyes nations, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and of course the UK is part of that, to be sister nations. So, from that point of view, I am politically sympathetic to those countries because I think that we have shared values. Likewise with Western Europe and other democracies around the world. So politically speaking, I value our relationship with countries like Canada and New Zealand, and although things have been strained from Brexit, I do hope that when this process is over, it's supposed to be finalising next month. I do sincerely and deeply hope that we can have relatively good relations with our closest neighbours. After all, they are our closest neighbours, the Irish, the Dutch, the French, and so on. Um, but that's politics, So I could be sympathetic to Canada, just as an example, politically, but there may be individual Canadians I don't care for, right? So I think it's important to differentiate. And just to extend that example, I may not like China, the Chinese government, but there's many individual Chinese people I like. I'm just like this is a very loose example. Um, so just for something different, I thought I'd have a look at British stereotypes and how people see my country. I was just looking like literally on Wikipedia stereotypes of Americans, and while some of those are negative, some are positive as well. So with Americans, so were things like nationalistic arrogance. The United States is the most powerful country in the world sometimes, and I think this is true. Sometimes some Americans do kind of think they're the best in everything, and they're not. There are areas where America lags behind. Um, Pro guns, well, there is definitely an enthusiasm for guns over there. Religious, there's a lot of other things. If you look at the Wikipedia article, it makes for interesting reading. But there is interesting, there's it's not all negative. So, for example, Americans are seen as generous, and I think that's true. I think individual Americans are hospitable people. When I went there in 1999, I have to say people were very accommodating. You know, we almost were almost overwhelmed with kindness. People invited us to their home. They were very hospitable. They showed us around. Um, so whilst there's certain traits of American culture I dislike, the gun thing I don't. That's still alien to me. I still can't quite. I think I'd be uncomfortable with that if I was in the United States. But for the most part, I like Americans, and not just because they're our sister nation, but I genuinely think most Americans are decent people. Um, and I do think they're generous people. But like I say, people are often products of their society, and there is an inbuilt mentality in the United States. We are the best at everything, and so I think it's among democratic countries. I think patriotism and nationalism, there's a thin line between the two. It runs quite deep. I would say more so than other Western countries. Um, but anyway, I'm waffling here, so I'll get to the this on British stereotypes and my response to them. Here's the thing I'll just say briefly about stereotypes. Sometimes when people criticize stereotypes, the implication is it's all false, i.e., don't judge people by their national stereotypes. Well, I totally agree with that. You can't judge people by what their passport says. I look at everyone as individuals. I think that's extremely important. But that doesn't mean that stereotypes aren't entirely baseless. Okay, stereotypes do come about from traits. Okay, I don't think it should be controversial to say that. It's just something that you find. Cultures are different. People are different. So stereotypes shouldn't be used as a way to judge people. However, it doesn't mean that they're entirely wrong. That's why sometimes when films are criticized for perpetuating stereotypes, I'm thinking, well, it doesn't mean that the stereotype is wrong. It's just that if it's, a singular vision or a sort of single dimension rather than being a multi-dimensional character, that's when it's perhaps problematic. But it doesn't mean that it is wrong in of itself. Okay, so this is the list I have on stereotypes of the British. I think, by the way, some of this will probably be a hangover from our days of empire. The British Empire a century ago was the most powerful power on earth. Above Russia and the United States at that time, we were the foremost global power. So I do suspect a lot of the global perception of the British comes from the legacy of empire and how the world sees British culture. Anyway, I'm just going to go through this list and my response as a British person. And one could say I'm a British minority in a sense because I'm not English. I'm Northern Irish. So my identity is also molded by that. So I'm putting that as a little caveat. Um, okay, politeness. Both historically and in the present day, the British have often been associated with good manners by many people around the world, similar to Canadians. I think that's probably true. Our Canadian cousins have a reputation for always saying please and thank you, and I think we do as well. Um, this is an interesting one because I think we are polite people. I think we do put focus on it. An example of this, I remember when I was at university, some German friends of mine said, Nathan, why did the cashier in Asda say please and thank you? And I'm like, well, that's just politeness, isn't it? And for them, it was like, well, we don't know them. It's not personal. And I could understand the point they were making. But, and incidentally, I've been to Germany 3 times. Germans tend to be a bit formal. They are polite in a different way, but maybe more formal. So I guess from their perspective, it was a bit unnecessary and almost over the top. I think the thing with politeness is that if it's overdone, it can seem almost insincere. But in of itself, I don't think it's a bad thing. I don't think that's a bad national trait, and I have no problem almost. I wouldn't say playing up the stereotype because I I do value politeness genuinely. That's in my personality. But if I'm stereotyped as the polite British guy, I'm not going to complain about that. But there is a kind of contradiction here because, ironically, whilst we have this reputation for politeness, paradoxically, we also, are known for our football hooligans. and some of the most obnoxious tourists around. I mean, I think only the Chinese and perhaps some Americans compete with the British for obnoxious tourists. Um, and with China, that's only a relatively recent development. Um, we have long had a reputation for our football fans behaving in a very bad way abroad, particularly with European Cup finals in the 80s and 90s. The stereotype was the notorious English football hooligans and Scottish to an extent as well, the so-called Tartan Army, where they would go to Rotterdam or Hamburg or Seville, get drunk, and just absolutely embarrass this country. Um, British tourists abroad, always get into fights in Spanish resorts. It became a pretty negative stereotype. So that is kind of the opposite, where we have this reputation for politeness, and yet we can be quite badly behaved abroad. Some of us, I should say. Humour. British people are well known for the use of sarcasm and irony. Some of the most highly regarded television comedies, such as Fawlty Towers and Mr. Bean, are British. I think that's true, and I think it's something the world knows us for. A good kind of glimpse at British culture was the London 2012 opening ceremony of the Olympics, and they featured Mr. Bean in that. Um, I'm biased, but I do think that British television is the best in the world for the most part. Um, I'm not saying we don't have rubbish, we do, but I do think I've looked at television from around the world. I do think we have very high quality TV for the most part, notwithstanding the fact that we also have rubbish. But British comedy is famous, and I think that's a fair stereotype. Um, I remember showing my students in China, or rather, it was something they had in their. It wasn't my students; it was a colleague of mine. She was teaching her students this, and they were looking at British satire. Now, some of that was political, which obviously in China can be taboo, but they just couldn't get their head around the fact that we're mocking our queen, we're mocking the prime minister. I mean, this would be unthinkable. In Thailand, for example, people wouldn't dream of mocking the royal family. In fact, you would get into trouble for it. Um, so self-deprecation is quite a British thing, and I don't think that's an entirely bad thing. Um, although to be fair, I think the Irish also have that, and maybe some other Europeans on some level as well. So I'm not sure that's a uniquely British thing, but I think that's a fair stereotype. Football. Football originated and is very popular within the United Kingdom. I'm not sure that's a stereotype, that's just a fact. Not really sure whether that's a stereotype. Tea is seen as a key part of British culture. Originally introduced as a luxury product in the 17th century, cheap import from colonial India allowed its consumption to significantly increase during the second half of the 19th century. So the tea drinking British. Well, it's true to some extent. We do drink a lot of tea, red tea with milk. In other parts of Europe, it's not so much with milk. However, I don't think we're the number one tea consumer in the world. In fact, per capita, the Irish drink more tea than we do. And of course, China and India are very big tea consumers as well. I think in world terms, we rank about sixth. So although there's the stereotype of the British tea drinker, I guess that goes again back to the day of empire. It would sort of be the British army officer in his red coat and pith helmet sipping his tea. In fact, the film Gettysburg, 1993, American Civil War film, it has a British character and he absolutely fits the stereotype. Colonel Fremantle. Now, in history, he was actually plain clothes. He wasn't in military fatigues. He was an observer on the Confederate side during the Battle of Gettysburg. But in the film, it's almost like they're throwing all the British stereotypes in there. He's got his red coat on, his pith helmet, and he's going around casually drinking his cup of tea, politely making conversation. It's quite laughable, but I kind of like the character, even though it was obviously exaggerated. I still rather like the character. So tea drinking is kind of a true stereotype. We do drink a lot. However, I would say these days coffee is just as popular, yet somehow we don't get the stereotype of the coffee drinking British. That's interesting. It may just be that coffee is also popular in pretty much every other country, certainly every other European country. Apparently, Swedes are very big coffee drinkers. Weather. According to a popular stereotype, weather in the United Kingdom is often seen as being poor, mostly consisting of either heavy rain or fog. In reality, British weather is generally fairly mild but changeable. We've had a fair amount of good weather in recent years, but actually talking about weather is a British stereotype. And again, I have to say this one's probably true. We do tend to make conversation that way. Like, even I find myself unconsciously doing it. Like, oh, what's the weather like there? When I'm talking to friends in other countries. So maybe that is a British stereotype. I actually think the article says that it's seen as being poor. I think British weather is fairly dull. What I mean by that is we are quite fortunate in this country. We never have major earthquakes. Occasionally we have serious storms, but not, for example, the sort of extent that the Gulf of Mexico has, or that's not the sort of powerful typhoons that would hit the Pacific nations. We can have serious storms, but I mean, flooding in this country would be major, major news, even if there weren't any fatalities. Yet that happens all the time in countries like the Philippines and Bangladesh. So it's a stereotype insofar as we do talk about the weather a lot. Okay. Teeth. Americans often joke about the British having bad or even buck teeth. You see this trope a lot on Family Guy. I have a theory where that came from. The royal family. Male members of the royal family don't have the best teeth in the world. British dentists are as good as dentists anywhere else in the world. Um, and actually, it's one part of our NHS that isn't free. You do have to pay for dental care. My own teeth are average. I wouldn't say they're great, but I wouldn't say they're bad. I've still got all my teeth. Um, they're not crooked. Um, but I think that comes from the royal family. Just because male members of the royal family are seen as having quite bad teeth, rightly or wrongly. Maybe that's where it comes from. But I don't think there's any actual evidence that the average Briton has worse teeth than anyone else. So that is probably a false stereotype. Food. Interesting one. Jokes are often told about the British food being either poor in quality or inedible. That's a bit harsh. Though historically British cuisine was generally fairly bland, since around the post-World War II period onwards, globalization and immigration have caused it to become significantly more diverse. Now, this is something where I'm going to play my patriotism card. British food is filling. We don't have the most ornate food in the world, so you don't come to Britain to see nice food sort of designed on a plate in an artistic way, as you might have with Japanese cuisine, for example. However, I would say British food is filling. If you want, I mean, take for example our pub culture. Pubs were traditionally not just drinking houses, but actually places where, on long journeys, for example, from Newcastle to London, coaches would stop by. So they would put the horses there for the night and they would have a filling evening meal. Um, Pub dinners are quite famous in this country. They're affordable, they're filling. Um, I certainly admit that we don't have the most exciting food in the world. However, I certainly don't think it's as bland as is implied. And I would say if you look at other Northern European countries, the Scandinavian countries, Germany, the Netherlands, I would say they're about I wouldn't say they're much more exciting than the British are. So maybe this is a Northern European thing. I mean, I think Italian food is the best in Europe, in my humble opinion. I personally think Italian food's much better than French food. But a few years ago, Jack Chirac, it was some big G8 meeting, was heard to whisper to fellow leaders, you half jokingly, you can't trust people whose food is so bad, referring to the British. And our tabloids had a bit of a field day with that. They got very jingoistic and, let's rubbish the French for a while. Um, I think what happened was at the time, a British chef, Heston Blumenthal, got a big prestigious award, a Michelin star. And that irritated the French because they do look down on British cuisine. But, there are things that are unique. I mean, fish and chips, good fish and chips. I don't think anywhere else in the world does it the way we do it. Possibly the Republic of Ireland, I'm not sure. But I mean, in the Netherlands, for example, they have smoked herrings. That's a big thing. The French might have fish with chips and mayonnaise, but it isn't the same thing. Good fish and chips with batter, and it has to be just the right composition. Just the right amount of fish, just the right amount of batter. It's hard to beat. And I know that some of my Chinese friends, they had mixed feelings about it. I think they found it tasty, but also a bit oily, or a bit greasy, which is probably true depending on the extent of batter. Um, but British food bad. I think we have diversified. I mean, a big part of this is our diaspora. I mean, or I should say the diaspora within the United Kingdom. We have some of the world's best Indian cuisine because of the Indian diaspora in the UK. In fact, some specific Indian dishes were invented in the UK. I believe the balti was invented in Birmingham, for example. So we certainly don't have the best food in the world. I would say, for me personally, I think either Italian or Chinese might get that accolade, or Indian, but I also don't think it's anywhere near as bad as it's made out to be. Um, but maybe it's just, I'm used to it. I don't know. We do have some things that are regionalized, like Yorkshire puddings, Lancashire hot pot, um, steak and ale pie. I would say the thing with British food is it's filling. We give quite sizable portions, so I don't think people could say that British food is not um, filling. I remember actually when Xi Jinping made a state visit here 5 years ago, David Cameron brought him to a local pub, and they gave these pathetic little portions of fish and chips. And I'm thinking, visiting head of state, obviously strained relations now, but back then there were better relations. I'm thinking, come on, David, bring him to a proper fish and chip place. Yeah. Um, okay. Monolingual. There's a common stereotype that the British are only able to speak English. This stereotype has some level of truth to it, as, like in many English-speaking countries, the level of bilingualism are relatively low. Well, with the exception of Canada, I would say it's also true in Australia. Canada, of course, people often speak French and English, but many parts of the United States, Australia, I would say people are monolingual. I think it's probably true. We do learn second languages at school, mostly French and Spanish, but I think it's sort of complacency because English is the world's most widely spoken language, not the most spoken language, but the most widely spoken language. We sort of are a bit lazy in this area, if I'm being honest. That is to say, we don't really feel a necessity to speak other languages. For my part, when I travel to other countries, I do try to speak a bit of the local language. I think it's respectful, and I just try. But a lot of Britons can't speak another language, and sometimes I look at other Europeans and Asian friends, and most of them can speak at least two languages. So be a little bit, maybe make us have some humble pie. I don't know, but what that is misleading in is that actually most British people do learn another language. It's just that by the time they leave school, it's largely forgotten. Um, but it doesn't mean there will be some Britons who are very, very adept at linguistics and can speak several languages. So that isn't